So, as I said, we now fast forward through 20 more odd chapters, and sorry to those authors who are here that we couldn't have everybody here. We should have had a whole day on this, really, but there we go. To chapters 24 and 26. I can't believe at this stage of the evening that no one has yet mentioned the energy trilemma, that nice little concept that signifies that there are these kind of three big objectives now that dominate energy policy in practically all countries of the world: decarbonisation and energy security and energy affordability, and obviously for businesses as well as households. And only the first one of those is really new, and the extent to which the others are met and how they are met will depend to a very large extent on how countries go about meeting their decarbonisation objectives. So I have no real apologies for focusing on that tonight, especially as this is a global energy, global climate evening. Something which is very striking to me as I look at the policy side of this is that actually the energy choices facing countries are political choices. There are all sorts of siren calls from industries saying you need our particular technology and you need to spend shed loads of money on it. And we would expect that, of course, but if one looks, different countries are making very different choices in pursuing those elements of the trilemma which are important to them at a particular time. The options will play out enormously differently in terms of energy security and cost. The economic and political cost of making the wrong decisions is very great indeed. There will need in innovation policy to be some balance between developing portfolios and encouraging diversity, and then picking winners quite unashamedly when it seems that it is clear which technologies can be driven to scale in order to drive down costs. The demand side will need to be dealt with very importantly. Most earlier assessments of energy futures have erred very greatly on exaggerating the supply that would be necessary, and of course there is a need for immediate decarbonisation and the avoidance of future carbon lock-in. Chapter 26 looks at those 5 bullet points in a bit of detail. Some of them have been dealt with in much more detail in earlier chapters, but the two I'm going to focus on in the next 2 slides have not. One is energy access, which is going to be an absolutely critical determinant of whether we meet our carbon targets or not. About 1.4 billion people in the world today don't have access to any kind of electricity, and they want that access, and increasingly they can get that access. The question is, what does that access mean in terms of the amount of electricity to which they will aspire? If you are the IEA, then it seems that it's this amount down here. This little button, no good, no, I shall go back. The top one, is it? Gives us a... no. All right, that's fine, I will cope without it. So, energy access, you can see the IEA at the bottom. That's their definition of energy access, where this is actual and projected global per capita electricity consumption. And you can see that it's very considerably below the Bulgarian per capita electricity consumption of 2010, which is the third of the bars down there. How that works out in terms of the amount of electricity that the currently unserved populations of the world want and how they choose to provide that electricity is going to have an enormous impact on global carbon emissions. The second elephant in the room, so to speak, which is dealt with a bit in this chapter, is the issue of urbanisation. An extraordinary factoid is that the majority of the urban infrastructure that will exist in 2050 still has to be built. We are going through a phenomenon of urbanisation that is unprecedented in the history of humanity. And whether the cities end up looking like Atlanta, which is the one on the left, or Barcelona, which is the one on the right, will have an enormous implication for global carbon emissions. Atlanta, the two cities are broadly the same population, they're broadly the same GDP. You can see that the urban footprint of Atlanta is many times that of Barcelona, and the carbon emissions per person in public and private transport are 7 tons CO2 per year, and in Barcelona they're 1/10 of that. So those kinds of differences are enormously important and will make a huge difference. Moving on then to the chapter 24, global energy scenarios, modelling the future. I see huge yawns coming from my UCL Energy Institute colleagues here because they know all this stuff much better than I do. Lots of uncertainty, which these models are intended to capture. The importance of being able to vary these assumptions and subject them to sensitivity analysis. This is the TM UCL model. I make no apologies for putting it up here because it is the result of over 10 years consistent investment by the research councils in the energy system modelling capacity in the UK. Neil Strachan is the particular genius who's been with this process ever since it started, now obviously at the UCL Energy Institute, and I think he's here somewhere in the audience, and has built round him a very expert modelling team that has carried out work using this model. I love this stuff, partly because I only try to understand it and I don't actually have to do it. It produces these marvellous little diagrams, such as the one on the right, which shows you the minimum rate of decarbonisation that will be necessary to meet the 2-degree target, depending on the peaking year of global emissions. And you can see that in order to reach a 2-degree target, we've got to start pretty well. If we've got to diminish at 3% a year, more or less immediately, and then the longer we leave the peaking, the more difficult it's going to be to meet those targets. I'm going to skip those because otherwise I should be shut up, and move just to one slide that has the 4 elements of what have emerged from those scenarios from our model which meet the 2-degree target. So if we look at the top left, you see that the 2DS scenario and the 2DS without bioenergy CCS, they are characterized by much more electricity than the other scenarios, the reference or the 3DS. And though that is a characteristic that emerges, electricity takes on a major role in the decarbonisation of both transport and heat, as well as serving classical functions of electricity use. If we look at the top right, we can see the greenhouse gas intensity of that electricity falling like a stone from about 500 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour in 2010 down to negative levels in 2035, a mere 25 years to effectively decarbonise the electricity system. Down at the bottom left here we have our model's version of contraction and convergence. Those are per capita greenhouse gas emissions on the y-axis, and you can see the high income, the middle income and the low income countries, the way that that develops. By 2050, the per capita incomes have not quite converged at the same level, but they are definitely moving in that direction. And finally, we don't impose carbon taxes. The model imposes its own kind of shadow carbon price to achieve this decarbonisation. And there you see the sorts of carbon prices that will be necessary if one were to use just carbon prices in order to decarbonise, rising to something like $600 a tonne by 2050. That seems a lot, until you realise that a country like the UK, with its gasoline and diesel taxes, already has an implicit carbon price, if that tax were a carbon price, of about half that. So you can see that moving towards a $600 per tonne carbon price by 2050 may not be quite as extraordinary and impossible as it sounds. Just a few wrap-up slides. The key elements of a low-carbon future are to do with costs of investments, financial requirements, and that Charles gave us a lot of detail and interesting comment on earlier. Innovation, technological research, development, deployment, institutions, policies, and social practices. That was something that Jim Watson talked a lot about. There is other work going on in the research councils as well, obviously, as in UK Energy Research Centre, on transitions. How do we actually get from here to there in detail, what needs to be put in place when, in order to ensure that we're ready to put the next building blocks in place and don't lock ourselves into a place that we don't want to go, and obviously issues of policies. It's an unprecedented policy challenge, but one that is eminently feasible. It depends to a large extent on carbon pricing, in my view, but carbon pricing absolutely buttressed and supported by technology policy to get the kind of innovation and investment that Jim and Jean-Charles were talking about, and the removal of barriers to the promotion of behaviour change. That was Nick Stern's menu of policy options back in 2007, and it's still pretty solid. So, conclusions. Effective climate policy. The kind of climate policy that will put us close to the track of 2 degrees will depend on, obviously, political will, and we're beginning to see that coming through with these intended nationally determined contributions coming through for the Paris COP in a few weeks' time. A recognition that the co-benefits of climate mitigation are as great, if not greater, than the actual carbon benefits. And this is particularly important for developing countries, which are much more focused on the present than the future. By co-benefits, I mean particularly air pollution. Many of you will have seen the estimates from the IMF recently that the costs of the fossil fuel economy, most of them external costs, in this year are estimated to be something like $5.3 trillion, which is a large sum, and a lot of those costs can be avoided by climate policy. UCL has played its part in trying to emphasize that through the production earlier this year of the UCL Lancet Commission report on global health and climate change, and we were very gratified by the amount of coverage that that receives. Further cost reductions in low carbon technologies. The cost reductions that we've seen, I missed out the slides of that, they are in the book obviously, have been simply extraordinary. And there's plenty more cost reduction in the major renewables technologies to come. There were similar cost reductions in nuclear, but they still seemingly are being held back by all sorts of other factors. But the renewables are really going it in terms of cost reduction, such that in many parts of the world they are now more or less cost competitive, given the need to build them into a functioning grid with other systems. And of course the desire in importing countries to limit exposure to fossil fuel exporters. My favourite example of that is Egypt, a fossil fuel importer sandwiched between Middle East fossil fuel exporters. Egypt now has a very ambitious programme of feed-in tariffs for solar energy, precisely in order to get itself off fossil fuels. It also has a lot of sun, and the feed-in tariffs it's having to pay are very small because the cost differential is much, much lower than it was. So my last thought, the limiting factor in ultimate fossil fuel consumption emissions will be on the demand rather than the supply side. Many of you will have heard the old saw. I was giving another talk at another place today where they hadn't heard this. They thought it was rather funny. So I'll say it again, but if you know it, well, you probably won't find it so funny a second time round. But the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. It ended because there were better things to use for what stones had been used for. And the fossil fuel age won't end because we run out of fossil fuels. The Earth's crust is absolutely swimming in the stuff. It will end because we find better ways, cleaner ways, smarter ways to meet the energy demands that we have. Thank you very much.